For people in Boston who know some of the history, the demolition and redevelopment of the West End is a local power struggle. But if you look beyond the urban villagers versus local powers, you can see the foundation put in place by national politics. That's the subject of a new exhibit at the West End Museum focusing on the Federal Housing Act of 1949. To tell us about the exhibit and the history is our guest from the museum, the co-curator and a member of the board, Bill Kuttner. Thank you very much, Bill.
Yeah.
And this exhibit, it starts out, at least on the surface, is a story about the upset victory of Harry Truman in 1949. What does that have to do with the West End?
Well, first of all, it's an exciting story in its own right. It's important. It tells you a lot about America. It tells you a lot about President Truman, and it gets people's interest. The hook that ties it into to urban policy is when he was running for president, Truman lambasted the Do-Nothing Congress.
Majority Republican, of course.
Yeah, yes. The Republicans, after the Roosevelt era, they had captured both chambers of Congress in 1946. They passed the Taft-Hartley Act, I won't go into, but so they really were not a Do-Nothing Congress, but there was a very ambitious federal housing bill that had been crafted at the waning days of World War II by Republican Robert Taft and Democratic Senator Robert Wagner. And this housing bill in 1945 had languished for years, and it was very ambitious, and it was seen as a solution to the housing problem of all the housing market had been in atrophy for 15 years. Our war heroes are coming back. They needed some place to stay other than mom and dad's sofa. So this was viewed as a crisis, and Truman challenged the quote Do-Nothing Congress to do something about it, and they were willing to expand the FHA a little bit, but they would not step up on slum clearance and federally funded public housing. So Truman does his vigorous whistle-stop tour, wins. He's the only guy who thought he'd win. He wins the upset election. The Democrats, on Truman's coattails, recapture both chambers of Congress. There's still the Housing Act of 1940. It's still controversial, but then they ended up enacting it. And many of the policies that ensued over the next 25 years came directly from the 1949 Housing Act. So it was important to Truman. It was happening at the time of Truman's victory. It was one of his key programs that he wanted.
Now, I'm sure this had great appeal for all those Truman Democrats and the trade unions who wanted a job creator, but Truman needed some votes from people down south. They were Democrats in those days, but they were different from the Democrats up north. So tell me about how that figured in this.
Well, the bill that came to Truman was called the Wagner-Ellender-Taft Act. So Wagner and Taft were senators, and Ellender was a congressman from Louisiana. He was actually, he sort of inherited Huey Long's machine, and he was a unapologetic segregationist. But he also he was a New Deal Democrat who favored public housing. He said, send us some money, our union brothers will build it. They'll just build two separate but equal housing complexes. And this was an important part of the New Deal coalition. The Southern Democrats, many of which were segregationists, and how you were going to deal with that in the final act was a problem. The opponents of the act having an amendment to ban discrimination, and it was a quote poison pill, because they knew that the Southern segregationist Democrats would vote against it if you banned if you.
It's interesting if you fast forward to some of the urban renewal projects that trickle down out of this. One case, New York City Lincoln Center, where they displaced a neighborhood of mostly Black and Latino residents. So I guess it wasn't just about us people down south.
Yes. Okay. Yes, true. Another problem. So we have so many problems here, but one of the problems was, they say slum clearance, but before you get slums, you get something known as blight. So you were worried about slums, and you were worried about blight than becoming slums. So cities were seen as going downhill, and something had to be done to stop them. So we Lincoln Center, West End, the idea is if there were federal funds available, that the federal regulations at that time, based upon this act, allowed money to be used to acquire property, tear it down, and have private developers build it. And in the resulting the developments would be more expensive. They would be better. The idea was to take these cities and have them bottom out and become better. So you would go to a place like the West End or around Lincoln Center. You would acquire the land. The people were tenants. They had to go somewhere else. You would build something. And it was the goal of the act, of the policy, that what was built afterwards would be higher income. And then you would arrest the decline of the cities by building these nice market rate housing. So things like Lincoln Center, like the West End, were deliberate outcomes that were sought. And this is independent questions of discrimination. Some of the as you say, some of the people who were displaced were all sorts of people.
How do you think this changed the plans for the West End? I mean, I guess it seems the obvious point is that the money wouldn't have been there otherwise.
Oh, absolutely, yes. The federal government, the 1949 Act was actually quite generous. They get a pot of money, city goes in, they have to buy the land, have to take it by eminent domain. You have to buy it at what it's worth. Some of these slums were actually making money. So when you go in there, you would if they acquired the land, it wasn't being abandoned. They actually had to buy it from the landowner, slumlord, if you will. They had to buy it, and it actually had economic value. So it was going to cost acquiring these blighted neighborhoods was going to cost the cities money, which the cities didn't have. In comes the federal government. They say you can use federal funds. Once you set up an authority like the BRA, they can use eminent domain. You have to do certain things. You can take the land. The federal government will pay for 2/3 of it, and your third you can even pay for in kind through things like road improvements and stuff like that. So the federal government wanted to take this ambitious program and put it within the financial reach of the municipalities that did not have money coming out their ears. And down in New York, Moses set up independent authorities. We were sort of behind the times and that type of thing.
Much more sophisticated than people around here.
Yes, absolutely.
But talk about the mixed feelings of people, because I think a lot of the same people who weren't happy to see the West End leveled and people just totally removed, they were happy to see all this government spending, the new things going up, the jobs being created. What about that?
Yes. The urban renewal did labor and like I say, slum clearance later in 1954 rebranded as urban renewal and one of the subsequent acts. But yes, there were people outside the neighborhood. You had, for instance, other taxpayers in the city, who were seeing a tax base being built. People had to live in the area. The unions, the trades that actually built it. Some of the private developers who could build a successful real estate portfolio. Yes, the slum clearance, later urban renewal, was popular. So there were two drawbacks. First of all, it did require the federal funds. So somebody in Washington, be it Eisenhower, Sam Rayburn, Lyndon Johnson, somebody in Washington had to say we're going to put the money into slum clearance instead of water projects out west. So it cost money. Even if people liked it, it wasn't going to happen until Washington sent the money. And then you have the forgotten people, the people who are displaced, which our West End Museum, celebrates their memory. But some people that are displaced, they get a job, they live in Malden, Medford, they're perfectly happy. They can say, West End was a great place, but they've moved on. What happened at the West End, the life and times of those people the main mission of the museum is to preserve that. Plus, we're tying in some of these other stories. And as you correctly say, what about the people who built it? What about the policymakers at the time who said our city's in trouble? We have to do something. They, in a way, they're almost the forgotten people as well. What informed people like Mayor Hines went to looking at their city and say we have to do something. This is one of the things they did. Congress made it possible.
Bill, we should make a mention a little bit about when the museum's open and how long they can take a look at this exhibit.
Check our website, West End Museum.
Simple as that. Thank you very much for being with us.
Okay, you're very welcome. You're very welcome.
Bill Kuttner from the West End Museum. We'll have more news in just a moment.